What up, YouTube? This is your boy, Adam of Nola. This is my channel, Skepticus. And today we're going to get into some sticky questions about how we should treat young Earth creationists. It's part of a broader discussion about how we should address or not people that espouse ideas that I'm going to call at multiple times in this video demonstrably stupid. I really think that this can be a sticky subject, especially for those of us who have deconstructed, because on one hand, it's easy to look at where we were and think, oh my gosh, I can't believe I ever thought that. I can't believe that people still think that. And then to pass judgment over them as being stupid. But on the other hand, if you have any empathy about you, it's also easy to look at those scenarios and say, man, I feel for those people. So how should we address that? I bring this up because someone left a very kind comment on one of my videos, and I think it serves as something of a good launching pad for this discussion today. So let me get into this comment. Local Art Witch says, I've been enjoying your videos lately and your Bible readings. Your voice is calming. I don't always hear that from people, but it's nice to know that my voice is calming. I was hoping, though, that you could try not to refer to people as stupid for being young Earth creationists / biblical literalists. I haven't seen your video, if there is one, about how you began to believe in the Christian God, but unfortunately for some of us, we were raised to believe that the Bible is a literally true history book. It's taught not just in church, but even in school, with extra learning materials. There's whole websites and young Earth museums dedicated toward misleading us. While you may have been reading books about the age of the Earth, I had books teaching me about Adam, Eve, and seeing them with dinosaurs. It's embarrassing now, but it has built a compassion in me for mistaught fundamentalists. A young Earth view is at least consistent with Christianity. And parenthetically, if Jesus died for our sins, then we can't have death before sin, correct? Thank you for an otherwise fantastic video. Looking forward to hearing you read through more of Exodus. Thank you for all that you do, Adam. So first and foremost, I have to say thank you. It's a wonderful comment, and I appreciate your feedback greatly. Before I get into the meat of this response, I will acknowledge that you mentioned whether or not I've talked about how I came about my own Christian ideas when I identified as a Christian. I have not talked about that at length in any video. I imagine I will at some point in the future. For me, a big part of that delay has just been about getting more subs. And I say that because I've seen where some atheists start a channel and they have really no audience. And one of the first couple videos they do is, here's my story about how I became a Christian and how I deconstructed. And their story might be very interesting, but it usually gets seen by a few dozen people because they just don't have an audience. Even with a larger audience, I do think that there are a lot of people who just really don't care that much about my personal story, my personal conversion into or out of Christianity, or maybe even anything personal about me at all. So I want to save something like that for a time when I at least have a larger audience of people who might be interested. Also, before I dive into the meat of this, I at least want to acknowledge that you've pointed out that young Earth creationism is at least consistent with Christianity. My only counter to that is this. Sure, it's consistent with Christianity. Some would even contend that it's the most consistent because it takes everything in the book so literally. But I want to point out that you can absolutely be Christian without holding any beliefs that are consistent with young Earth creationism. One of the things that annoys me about the fundamentalists is that sometimes they talk about other denominations and other beliefs, other Christian beliefs, as though they are somehow apostates, as though they are somehow inconsistent with Christianity itself. Of course, they're working usually from this perspective that if you don't take every word of the Bible literally, hyper literally, that you are somehow more inconsistent than they are. And that always annoyed the hell out of me, even when I was a Christian. I had no friends who were young earth creationists, and I don't think I could have gotten along with too many of them because this idea that to be consistent with Christianity, you should have to be fundamentalist. And I know that's not what you said in your original post, but that idea offends me deeply. Even now, as an atheist, it offends me deeply because it is so doctrinally incorrect. And I suppose that on some level, it's that annoyance that from time to time puts me in a position where I feel less inclined to show them much grace. So the first big idea here that I really want to make absolutely clear before I say anything else is that I do feel it is important whenever possible, as frequently as is necessary, to make a clear distinction between stupid people and stupid ideas. I'm usually of the belief that there actually aren't very many stupid people in the world. Stupid to me implies someone who may be incapable of higher education, someone who may not have the facilities that are necessary to do advanced reasoning, logic, etc. Someone who just doesn't have the mental capacity. I think that under the proper conditions, almost all people are capable of performing great intellectual feats. And I don't think for a second that because you have a stupid idea in your head, that means that you are a stupid person. I say this a lot about apologists in general. While I don't have much respect for the whole field or discipline, if you will, of apologetics, that does not mean that I think that apologists are stupid people. And I know that when I say apologists here, that doesn't necessarily mean fundamentalists, but sometimes they're in the same bucket, right? But you can hold a very stupid idea and be an incredibly intelligent person. When I look at the likes of William Lane Craig or Sean McDowell, they're not stupid people at all. And I would never accuse them of being intellectually deficient. These are people with PhDs. These are people that have done their own independent research. These are people that have probably thought very deeply on all things related to Bibles and religion and Christianity specifically. So they're not stupid people. And it can be very dangerous to fall into this trap of thinking of them as stupid people, because you never want to underestimate those who are espousing stupid ideas. Because as soon as you assume that one who espouses stupid ideas is in fact stupid, you then are essentially bringing a knife to a gunfight. You're not giving them the due that they deserve, and you're in a really good spot to be exposed when they make it clear to the audience that they're not stupid and they've thought these points through deeply, even if their conclusions are problematic. But as you've pointed out with regard to fundamentalism and literalism, this is a process of indoctrination. And some fabulously intelligent people have fallen into horrific areas of indoctrination all throughout history. Look at cults. And yes, I know we can call Christianity a cult if I really wanted to poke someone today. But cults in general feel very stupid from the outside. You wonder, how could somebody ever get in on that? Or multi-level marketing, which also may be a cult, but that's a discussion for another day. You can look at it from the outside and say, how did anyone ever embrace this? But it doesn't mean that everyone involved in it is stupid. You can have stupid ideas and still be a very intelligent individual. I freely admit that. I will also admit that sometimes when you watch some of my videos, I may not do a good enough job of making that clear. Part of that is just because my voice is somewhat bombastic at times. That's not an excuse. It's just an acknowledgement. It's also because if I'm trying to make content that is engaging for viewers, you can sap a lot of the life from that content by constantly making apologies for people, by constantly saying, I know that these people aren't stupid, and I know that there are good people who are Christians, and I know that not all Christians believe these things, and I know, and you make all of these accommodations, rhetorically speaking, to try to prophylactically stop any of the attacks that you might get. There's a time and a place for that, and I do that sometimes, maybe even too much. But other times, you just kind of talk through things. Sometimes you just present your position, even if it ruffles a few feathers. I'm not saying any of that as an excuse. And if I ever come across as being rude or overly confrontational, unnecessarily so, you are always free to put more comments down below and to correct me. And I may not always agree with you, but I read them all. I reply when I can. And I have received some comments about places where I may not have been as charitable as I should have been to my opponents out there in the Christian world. So all of that feedback is valid and welcome at all times. But when it comes to fundamentalists, here is the meat of the discussion. This is the most important distinction in my mind that I want to communicate in this video. The distinction I'm talking about is this. It is very important to distinguish between articles of faith versus ideas that are demonstrably stupid. What do I mean by that? Well, despite me being an atheist, I was a Christian for 40 years. I know what it's like to be a Christian. I know what it's like to think in these terms. And there are, by definition, many aspects of Christianity specifically, or theism in general, that are almost always unfalsifiable. In other words, they are positions that if you are to follow the religion, you need to take on faith. They are purely articles of faith. These are things like belief in the God or gods themselves. That mere belief itself is an article of faith. No matter what any apologist tells you, they cannot and will never be able to prove their God, and not unless they radically change the definition of God himself. In the definitions that I have always seen for Christianity and almost every other religion, every other theist religion, their definition of God is unfalsifiable. They cannot prove it, and I cannot disprove it. In other words, it is an article of faith. The virgin birth, article of faith. The idea that Jesus himself was the actual Son of God, another article of faith. Whether or not Jesus actually performed any of his miracles is purely an article of faith. The resurrection, despite the sad claims that I've seen from so many apologists, like they can make this great case about how it's the best explanation for the events, or about how it's not only plausible, but mathematically probable. I mean, stop it. The resurrection is an article of faith. Even the Trinity, which is not in the Bible per se, but Trinitarians piece together all these pieces from the Bible so that they can make a case for the Trinity. But the Trinity itself is, once again, an article of faith. If it's not already painfully clear, what I mean when I say article of faith is that these are things that you believe as an adherent of the religion, and yet you cannot prove them. And even as an ardent skeptic, I cannot possibly disprove them. You either have to accept them as an article of faith, or you don't. I don't have any problem with articles of faith. I mean, I could sit here on a side video and talk about how I think that some of these things are ridiculous, and I do. But generally speaking, I do understand that if you're going to be a Christian, these are the kind of things that you're probably going to believe. Some of them you almost have to believe if you want to hold the mantle of Christian. I can't disprove them. You can't prove them. They're articles of faith. That's fine. But an article of faith is very different from a demonstrably stupid idea. What do I mean by demonstrably stupid ideas? Well, one would be that the earth and or the entire universe is 6,000 years old. Demonstrably stupid. Or that the earth is flat. Or that dinosaurs and humans lived side by side. Or I've heard this one too, that dinosaurs never even existed. And all of the evidence that we see in the paleontological record purely came from Satan trying to deceive us. Or the moon landing never happened. Or evolution is false. Or vaccinations cause autism. These are all ideas that are demonstrably false and demonstrably stupid. I don't care if that conflicts with your ideas of faith. I don't care if you were raised from the time of birth to believe that every word in the Bible is literal truth. These are things that we can disprove easily with loads and loads of empirical, scientific, naturalistic evidence. If you want to refute these things, it's because you are taking your rational brain, the brain which was given to you by God, apparently, and you are just setting it right over here. Yeah, I'm just going to take this out. I'm going to put it right over here. I'm going to read my Bible because I won't need my brain while I'm reading my Bible, or I'm going to go to Bible study, or I'm going to go to sermon this. I'm going to go listen to the sermon this Sunday, because when I'm doing those things, I'm just going to take my brain out and put it right over there. I'll get a little box and put my brain in, because all of these things are clearly refuted. It's not even a debate amongst anyone who's not already a dyed-in-the-wool fundamentalist. And if you hold those types of beliefs, I understand that you may have been deeply indoctrinated in them. But if you are holding so dearly to ideas that are so clearly falsifiable, I can't give you the credit for just following an article of faith. In those cases, you are adhering desperately to ideas that are demonstrably stupid. So as if that weren't clear enough already, I think you can tell by my tenor that I don't have sympathy for those who cling to such ideas. I have empathy for the fact that they have been indoctrinated into this way of life. I have empathy for the fact that religion, in all of its forms, is dependent upon brainwashing. And to some extent, you can't control that because you weren't in control of the situations that you were born into. But at some point, we all have the responsibility as adult, grown-ass people to embrace and listen to our logical brain, the brain which was supposedly given to us by your God, and which at this point is the most advanced natural computer that we have ever found. Now, we may find alien species in the future that are more advanced than us intellectually and elsewhere. But in terms of the life forms that we have found in this universe, which basically means the life forms that we have found on this planet, we have found no other example of a computing device that is more advanced than what God has given us as our brain. And if you're going to tell me that I'm not supposed to use that brain, then at that point, you have lost all sympathy I might have given you in anything approaching an intellectual conversation. The key distinction between the articles of faith and demonstrably stupid ideas are those things that can be falsified or not. As long as you are clinging to the unfalsifiable claims of your religion, I may not agree with those claims, but I can at least give you this type of respect and say, hey, everyone has their own religious beliefs. Everyone looks out in the stars and has their own idea of how things came to be or who's controlling the narrative. And as long as you don't expect me to give you respect for ideas that are demonstrably false, as long as your ideas in this regard are truly unfalsifiable, I won't agree with your ideas, but at least I can say, you know what? That's what you think. Here's what I think. Let's move on. Part of my stance on this issue is that while I do understand that indoctrination is incredibly real and incredibly difficult to break, you can absolutely disavow yourself of demonstrably stupid ideas. But in order to do it, you must first be willing to research honestly. Honestly is a key part there. Because if you think that you're going to research the age of the earth, and all of the information you're getting is coming from your Bible, or it's coming from the Discovery Institute, or it's coming from Answers in Genesis, or it's coming from your pastor, or it's coming from your Young Earth Creationist forum on Reddit, then there is nothing remotely honest about that. You are just engaging deeply in confirmation bias. But if you actually make even a reasonably honest attempt to look not just in creationist circles, but to dive into the scientific literature on things like the age of the earth and evolutionary biology and the Big Bang, etc., etc., there is not a dearth of information. There is not, oh, this pile over here for creationism and this pile over here that's the same size for science. No, creationism is this dirty little speck on the ass of humanity. And science, the scientific consensus, the empirical evidence is massive and overwhelming. And if you don't know that, it's because you haven't done any honest research, and I can't afford you any respect for your ideas, even if those ideas came about as a result of indoctrination. So some of this may come across as kind of salty. I know. Maybe the tenor that I'm projecting right now in this video is the same tenor that the original poster was replying to. Maybe it sounds like I'm fairly combative when it comes to young Earth creationists. So a couple notes on that front. First of all, I don't spend time out amongst the people in real space and meat space trying to hunt down young Earth creationists and yell them down. In fact, that would be the last way I would ever want to spend any of my time when I'm not here in front of this camera. Even on my channel, I have absolutely touched on young Earth creationist issues. I've done a few videos that have spoken specifically to the ridiculous claims of young Earth creationists, but this has never been and will never be a channel which is solely dedicated to debunking young Earth creationist claims. I don't say that because they don't need to be debunked. Their ideas are ridiculous and they should be debunked at every turn. But dealing with young Earth creationists specifically, I'm not talking about Christians in general. I'm not talking about devout religious people. I'm talking specifically about young Earth creationists. They are some of the biggest pains in the asses to deal with. They are what I would call the worst kind of wrong. What I mean by that is that they're not just satisfied to be wrong. They're arrogantly wrong. They're not just content in their self-delusion. They will talk down to you because you have the audacity to put confidence in empirical evidence, reproducible results, and the collective intelligence of the entire worldwide scientific community. And despite having all of that in your favor, they will not only try to refute you, but they'll talk about you in your arguments as though you are the idiot with the wool pulled over your eyes. And you clearly haven't looked into this. And you clearly don't understand the maths. And you clearly don't understand the science. And if you weren't part of the scientific industrial establishment, you would see that young Earth creationism is the only true thing. I mean, the crap that comes out of their mouths is unbearable at times. When you do try to engage with them, it is like trying to hug a fart. Every time you grasp at something, they will just dance and weave away. They will spew an endless series of gish gallops at you. They will try to overpower you with ridiculous, nonsensical facts. And by the way, their numbers and their facts always come from their own sources. In other words, one of these idiots will spend all this time on the Discovery Institute's website or the Answers in Genesis website or watching all of the videos that come from these websites. And then they will start spewing the ridiculous numbers that they get from these anti-intelligence, anti-science places, and they will talk to you as though you're an idiot and they're the ones who have achieved true knowledge. To put it in the simplest possible way, young Earth creationists are fucking exhausting. There are great analogies I could give you for this that aren't even necessarily religious. The most apropos one in my mind is the flat earthers. If you've spent any time kind of checking out the periphery of this ridiculous flat eartherism, you will see that there are these people who will argue endlessly for a flat earth, despite all of the empirical evidence absolutely obliterating their argument. There are entire channels dedicated to flat eartherism. And of course, there are channels dedicated to debunking flat eartherism. And I respect those people who spend all this time debunking them because it's yeoman's work. It's God's work. It really needs to be done. People need to shout these idiots down. And yet, at the same time, it's exhausting because trying to argue with a flat earther or a young earth creationist is like trying to hug a fart. Every time you will absolutely refute what they've said, they'll just dance away. They can't be pinned down. They will move the goalposts. They will come up with their own statistics that have been gleaned from their own biased sources. They will put their fingers in their ears and say, la, 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 you're so stupid. You don't know the truth. It doesn't matter. You can show them empirically every possible way that every one of their contentions is patently ridiculous. And yet they will still keep on with their diarrhea of the mouth and their ridiculous conspiracy theories. And then they'll act like you're the one who's an idiot because you aren't smart enough to look into the real facts and you haven't figured out the real truth and you're just following this big scientific conspiracy. I've watched a lot of these videos. For example, Planet Peterson on numerous occasions will entertain flat earthers on his show. And you can literally give them the evidence that refutes their claim exactly. And even after you do that, they will usually do one of two things. Either they will just dance off to another discredited theory or another discredited piece of evidence and completely ignore the fact that you've refuted this piece. Or, even worse, they will blindly restate the exact same thing that you've just refuted. They will literally refuse to acknowledge what you've just told them or shown them or demonstrated to them in any way. In other words, they don't need to be bothered with the exact evidence that you've given them. They will still just cling to their ignorance like this wet blanket of hope. I'm not going to make this whole video about responses to young earth creationists, but as an example, I want to give you two comments that were recently put on my videos as a way to illustrate the sheer ignorance that comes out of these people's mouths on a daily or hourly basis. This first comment came on a video that I did, which was a response to Answers in Genesis Canada, where this smug, self-satisfied asshole that runs that site did this video where he's talking to Grok, and he gets Grok to spit back all of the creationist talking points. And he does it in this very slick and disingenuous way that most people would never even realize when they are watching the video. So in other words, I took time to completely debunk everything that was in this ridiculous creationist, propagandist bullshit of a video from Answers in Genesis Canada. And despite that, here's one of the responses that I get back. This complete imbecile says, Odds of evolution by natural selection with no higher power or creator. 10 to the 200th power for a single cell-X organism to appear on its own. 10 to the 600th power for each new species that evolves. According to ChatGPT and Grok, these odds make evolution by natural selection with no higher power involved effectively impossible. AI knows more than the host of this video and his audience put together. Ask AI yourself if you don't believe me. This ridiculous comment is put in response to a video where I had already answered these exact points. These stats that he's pulling up were not calculated by AI. This was AI acting as essentially a glorified search engine, which with the proper prompts was told to essentially go look up the information from the Discovery Institute and the Answers in Genesis website. How would you like to be one of my advisors? I'm using Skepticus's memberships as a way to allow you to have a voice in the content and the direction of this channel. I hope to see you in the membership pool, and I want to hear your voice in what Skepticus is doing going forward. In other words, this is an example of getting Grok or ChatGPT or any LLM to play tennis with itself. You are giving it all of the prompts you need to tell it to, hey, only go look at the sources I prefer. And then you ask it these questions and it comes up with these non-statistics, which have been repeated ad nauseum and completely debunked on all of the creationist websites. And instead of engaging with any of the material there, what does he do? He just spits out the same damn numbers again. Because it doesn't matter if you debunk them. It doesn't matter if you show that every one of their arguments is patently false and demonstrably stupid. They're still going to keep parroting the same crap over and over and over again. Creationism is the religious version of verbal diarrhea. It doesn't matter what you give them to treat the diarrhea. They're going to keep dribbling this tripe out of their mouth until they no longer have a mouth to speak with. This is why I say that these people, even if they've arrived here via indoctrination, deserve no sympathy, no empathy. If you wanted to learn, even at a layman's level, the state of science as it relates to evolution, that is all freely available. But this imbecile doesn't want to learn that. They don't even want to engage with the content in the video. All they want to do is regurgitate the exact same points that were already refuted in the video that he's responding to. This is the textbook example of an imbecile. And this is the kind of crap that you deal with anytime you find yourself in the unfortunate scenario of talking with a young Earth creationist. The second imbecile that I'm going to highlight here, and then I'll move on from these comments. This person says, seashells and aquatic life remains are found on top of mountains, including some not near the ocean. I haven't heard a cogent explanation as to why. If you haven't heard a cogent explanation for this, it's because you are not trying. You are actively shutting off your ears and your brain to anything that can possibly explain this, because the answer to this isn't even hard. It's been answered over and over and over again. And if you Google it in a way that doesn't just go back to your same Reddit forums and your same Answers in Genesis talking points, you would have the answer for this already. But nonetheless, I answered him and said, OMFG, this isn't hard. It's called plate tectonics. The Earth, we know now, is billions of years old. The exact age, of course, we do not know, but we know it's billions of years old. Plate tectonics have been a force on the surface of our planet for nearly all of that time. And this action of plate tectonics drives mountains up from the depths of the sea and grinds them back down over the course of tens or hundreds of millions of years. We can actually measure and see some of this in real time today. Of course, we've never seen a mountain rise from sea level up to Mount Everest. We've never witnessed that in real time because that takes tens of millions or hundreds of millions of years. But we know this process very well. It is so well documented. The movement of tectonic plates, the process by which they separate and create new seas, the process by which they collide and create new mountains, it isn't even hard, people. But despite me saying this, this is what the imbecile replies. In geologic time, which is viewed differently than literal years, make the explanation of plate tectonics a beyond weak explanation. If land was displaced to the degree that some of the highest mountaintops have fossils of sea life, that plate movement would have destroyed all non-ocean dwelling life. I can give you mathematically sound reasons it would be the case, by the way. No, you can't. You can give no sound reasons whatsoever because you are practicing nothing but verbal diarrhea. And you obviously have no desire to engage with the facts whatsoever. Plate tectonics takes place over hundreds of millions of years. So no, there is nothing about a mountain rising up that would inviolate life, that would destroy life as we know it. And nothing would be mathematically sound that would invalidate any of this. You simply have no desire to learn whatsoever. You've taken your entire brain and you said, oh, my religion tells me what to do, so here, let's put it right over here. I won't be needing that anymore because I have Jeebus. And as long as I have Jeebus, we can just take this out, put it right over here, and we're done. That's all we got to do. Now, it would be very easy to dismiss these young earth creationists as nothing but a nutty, but ultimately harmless extremist faction of Christianity. Unfortunately, I don't think that is a valid way to look at this at all. First and foremost, there are the words of the original poster herself, because she talked about how she was raised in this. She was indoctrinated in this. She was given false study materials. She was taught by her respected authority figures to disengage from legitimate, knowledgeable, empirical, scientific discourse and to instead replace it with the BS, with the drivel that you get from your religious pablum. She was brought through a process of indoctrination. Do I have empathy for her since she had to go through that? Of course I do. And thankfully, it sounds like she escaped it. And I'm not going to make it sound like it's easy to escape it because indoctrination is never easy to escape. But her own comment illustrates how dangerous this is, because when we're talking about religion, and we're talking about something as patently ridiculous and demonstrably stupid as young earth creationism, we're not just talking about one lone guy sitting in his room, in his living room, having crazy religious ideas. Religion is, by its nature, indoctrinated amongst so many people and indoctrinated amongst the most vulnerable of people, which is our children. If this one hypothetical guy has this crazy ideas that every word of the Bible is literal truth, well, we all know they don't stop with that one guy, do they? No, those ideas then get imprinted unwillingly on anyone who that person raises, and to a lesser extent, anyone who that person influences as part of his community or as part of his extended family. So while I want to be careful at all times to, within reason, not sound like I'm attacking the character of those who were raised in and indoctrinated in ideas of young earth creationism, it's also important to recognize that their ideas are not just demonstrably false and stupid, but they're outright dangerous. They're dangerous because they are factually not even similar to anything real. But on top of that, they are also used to indoctrinate every new generation of people going forward. To put this in the simplest terms possible, while I have empathy for those who have been indoctrinated, those people are or will very soon be the next level or the next generation of indoctrinators. If you have someone who is raised from early childhood to believe this crap, for a while, they are just a victim. But how long is it before they start raising kids of their own? And the cycle continues. People could start having kids when they're 15 or 16, even if they don't start that early. I mean, by the time they're 21 or 22, they've probably started a family, in which case they are repeating the cycle of spreading demonstrably stupid ideas to the next generation. This is a big part of the reason why I feel adamant, religious even, about this channel. On one level, you can say, why be the angry atheist, Adam? Why not just let people have their beliefs? And why do you have to put out this content that ruffles people's feathers? But these ideas that they have, it's not just that they have demonstrably false and stupid ideas. It's that these ideas are dangerous in their own right. They have contributed, at least here in the US, to this increasing sense of scientific and intellectual illiteracy that I have witnessed in my own lifetime to a disturbing extent. Let me give you just a few numbers to back up what I'm talking about. According to a University of Michigan study from 2021, 30% of Americans continue to be religious fundamentalists. So on the surface, you might think, well, okay, so there's 30% fundamentalists. Although if you know anything about worldwide religious populations, even that 30% number is kind of alarming, because the percentage of fundamentalists, meaning biblical literalists in other countries, is usually far lower. But in America, 30%, not of Christians, but 30% of Americans overall are religious fundamentalists. That then contributes to this fun little nugget of information, which is that 46% of Americans today, well, as of 2021, which is 4 years ago, but 46% of those Americans do not agree with the statement that human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. Now, when this study came out in 2021, they were heralding the fact that finally there was a majority of Americans, apparently somewhere around 54%, who agree with the idea that human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. But that doesn't make me feel really good, because it means that I am living in a country that is drenched with 46% of the population who does not believe in evolution. But it's not just 46% of the overall American population that's the concern, because I'm sure you realize that when we break it down by parties, those percentages get a lot more skewed. Specifically, 66% of Republicans do not agree with the statement that human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. Just to give you another source on this as well, if we go back to 2019, there was a Pew Research study which showed that 65% of Americans believed that humans and other living things have evolved, which of course means that 35% of Americans did not. 31% stated that humans and other living things have always existed in their present form. Ladies and gentlemen, that is fundamentalism. And it's very consistent with the finding that 30% of Americans overall continue to be religious fundamentalists. Now, this data is a little older still, but The Wikipedia article about the acceptance of evolution says that as of 2014, nearly all, which they define as around 98%, nearly all of the scientific community accepts evolution as the dominant scientific theory of biological diversity, with, as of 2009, some 87% accepting that evolution occurs due to natural processes, such as natural selection. Now, if you're wondering what's the difference between 87% and 98%, it's because you're going to have some scientists who have taken an old Earth creationist view, which means that they say, well, evolution happened and is happening, but it's still the directed hand of God. I don't have nearly as much beef with old Earth creationists because that's essentially just putting God into the framework of the empirical, observable, scientific universe. But I want you to think about this. 98% of scientists accepting evolution. And I would even argue that those other 2% probably aren't from the hard sciences. But 98%. If you poll almost any group on any question, it's nearly impossible to get 98% of them to agree on anything. If I went through a group of 1,000 people and polled them and said, our baby's cute, I could not get 98% of them to agree. If I said, is ice cream yummy, I could not get 98% of them to agree. If you learn enough about polling and public opinions, you realize that at a certain point, anything over 80 or 85% is essentially almost unachievable unless you have a question that is almost unquestionable. So the fact that in 2014, 98% of the scientific community accepted evolution, that should tell you a whole lot. And if what it tells you is that, yes, that's because all scientists hate God and they are in a conspiracy to hide the truth of intelligent design and creationism, then you are demonstrably stupid. Now, I've touched on this already when I talked about the fact that 2/3 of Republicans don't agree or don't admit that evolution is real. I don't talk a lot about politics here. I have mentioned it a few times. Every time I do, it pisses off a few people in the comments, and I don't care. You can leave and never come back if this is going to bother you, what I'm about to say. I really couldn't care less. But think about this. 2/3 of Republicans can't even acknowledge the scientific truth of evolution. This country right now has a president that is a Republican. It has a legislature, which is controlled by Republicans. It has the court system, including the Supreme Court, which now is dominated by Republican appointees. And if you're a Republican, that's fine. I'm not here to argue that you should be a Democrat or conservatives are bad or anything like that. But when you have this whole system, which is backed up by a party that doesn't even acknowledge the scientific truth of evolution, are you really going to trust that the office of the president or anyone in the Congress or anyone in the courts can reflect scientific literacy in their policies and decisions when their constituency is so heavily against the plain scientific, naturalistic, empirical truth? Think about this another way. If someone is unwilling or incapable of understanding the scientific consensus on evolution, then do you really want them creating public policy on matters such as your healthcare or climate change or the standards by which your children should be educated or any type of regulation that affects technological advancements? In other words, if someone can't even acknowledge what is known by 98% of the scientific community, how much can you trust those same people to make any kind of public policy that's not just based on their thoughts and their feelings and what the good book tells them? Now, I know you may think, well, Adam, you're being unfair. Just because someone believes in young earth creationism, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be logical in other areas, right? But think about this. Young Earth creationism requires you to completely discard entire fields of scientific research. Fields like evolutionary biology, genealogy, radiometry, geology, stratigraphy, glaciology, cosmology, astronomy, paleontology. Young Earth creationism also conflicts in many ways with broader aspects of science, such as physics and chemistry. So if somebody can't be bothered to even acknowledge any of the truths that are found by the entire worldwide community in all these disciplines, you still want to tell me that's not a problem to have these same people making public policy and important decisions about our future. Finally, I want to make it clear that this is not just a problem for a small handful of religious extremists. Yes, I'm picking on some level on the young earth extremists because they are some of the worst examples. But the simple fact is that exposure to religion in general and fundamentalism specifically, it creates this kind of sliding scale of stupid. The closer that you get to fundamentalism, the more likely that you are to outright reject any reasoned, intellectual, empirical decision-making in favor of legends and miracles and dogma. But you don't have to move the slider all the way towards fundamentalism to recognize and realize some of these harmful effects. This religious impact on stupid, unfortunately, is not an accident. Religion literally trains you to disavow logical conclusions. And if you can't admit that, you are indoctrinated yourself. Even if you are a reasonable religious person, when you open that Bible and you read through those stories and you see the number of miracles, the number of talking donkeys and acts of God and earth being created in 6 days and all this other stuff, I mean, you can believe that if you want, but if you believe that those are logical conclusions based on a naturalistic understanding of our own universe, then you have already been trained to disavow logical conclusions. In that same theme, religion trains you to accept as truth those things which literally cannot be proven. Every miracle claim, it can't be proven. Again, I know some Christians will try to tell you all day that things like the resurrection can be proven, and that's just laughable. And I'm not mad if you believe in miracles, but these things cannot be proven. If they could be proven, they wouldn't be miracles. They would just be naturalistic events. They cannot be proven. If you want to believe in them, that's fine. But religion is training you to believe in those things that cannot be proven. As a corollary to that, religion is also training you to quiet your own natural instinct to question things. If we took religion out of it, and if I just walked up to you on the street and told you half of the claims that Christianity makes, and I said, yeah, these things totally happen, you would think I was an idiot. You would think I was insane. You would want to get away from me as fast as possible. But as long as I couch it in your religion of choice, which is in the US usually Christianity, then it's fine. You stop questioning. You quiet your rational mind. And then worst of all, religion trains you to extol this ignorance as virtue. The more you question, the weaker your faith, and that's bad. The less you question, the more you are seen as being virtuous in a religious light. And although I don't think that any religions are great, I think that all religions have some really bad aspects. The sad part is that the closer you get on this kind of ladder of fundamentalism, the more stupid you become. Here's what I'm talking about. This is from Wikipedia. So this is talking about percentage who agree that evolution is the best explanation for the origin of human life on Earth. Well, for Buddhists, 81% of them agree with that, which makes total sense because Buddhism is not theist. It is a religion, but it's not theist. So that's pretty far away from fundamentalism. And then Hindus, which absolutely are theist, 80% of them think that evolution is real. And now we get into Yahwism. Jewish people would say at a 77% clip that evolution is real. And then Catholics are 58%. Orthodox are less than that. Then we get into the mainline Protestants. Now we're getting to 51% think evolution is real. Then we're getting to evangelical Protestants. They believe at only a 24% clip that evolution is real. And then at the bottom of that ladder is Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe only at an 8% level that evolution is real. Now, I know you might say, well, I'm a fundamentalist. I don't agree with Jehovah's Witnesses at all. You might have very deep doctrinal differences with them, but you're both very fundamentalist. I thought that this chart was fascinating because, like I said, to me, it's almost like looking at a ladder with proximity to Yahweh being at the bottom of the ladder and the least adoption of evolution, and then distance from Yahweh being at the very top of the ladder. And it seems like the closer and closer that you get to Yahweh, the more and more likely that you are to completely disavow your rational, logical brain and throw evolution out the window. We have a few other charts here from Pew Research and from a Gallup poll, and they show that amongst the public, young Earth creationism is 31%, but amongst scientists, it's 2%. But I find it more interesting to look at the Gallup poll with regard to church attendance. And this says that if you attend church weekly, there's a 69% chance in the US that you are a young Earth creationist. If you attend church nearly weekly or monthly, there's a 47% chance. And if you seldom or never attend a church, that percentage falls to 23%. In other words, the more often you go to church, the more likely you are to throw reason and logic out the damn window. So the problem here isn't just that there are some religious extremists out there who wear their scientific ignorance like a badge of honor. The deeper problem, in my humble opinion, is that nearly all religious people, especially U.S. Christians, are somewhere on that scale, even if they don't identify with labels such as literalists, fundamentalists, or evangelicals. More importantly, to me at least, is that even for those who are more reasonable in their beliefs, they tend to ignore or reject any suggestion that they should call out those who are waving the banner of ignorance. In other words, maybe you're a very pragmatic Christian. Maybe your whole denomination or your whole church believes in evolution. And if that is the case, great. I'm happy for you. But you never see like one denomination or one church calling out another and saying these thoughts that you have are ridiculous. Now, I know that's a rabbit hole because you can say, well, we don't want to get into this interdenominational war. But if there was a denomination, a Christian denomination, who made as a central tenet of their faith this idea that we all descended from aliens, other Christians would call them out. They would disavow them. But when it comes to fundamentalists, literalists, evangelicals, even for those people who don't identify with those labels, they usually have no stomach whatsoever for calling out anyone. The general idea in Christianity is that, well, that group over there, they may have radically different ideas than me, and I may think that they're on the wrong path, but their ideas are their ideas, my ideas are my ideas, and everyone just kind of keeps to themselves. Now, they might squabble if they get into Reddit discussions or whatever about who's going to hell and who's not. But in terms of public discourse, you don't hear the Lutherans saying that young Earth creationism is ridiculous. You don't hear the Baptists telling the Pentecostals that they got it all wrong. They generally tend to leave each other alone. And while that may seem like a good thing because it feels better than a whole bunch of interdisciplinary squabbling, in this case, I would posit that it just furthers this proliferation of ignorance. So let me wrap this up. I know this has gotten long. In conclusion, I want to say again, thank you to Local Art Witch for her thoughtful comment. I don't totally disagree with what she's saying because it is important at all times to maintain empathy, to understand that some people, unfortunately, are in the matrix. And some of the ideas that they are espousing are not truly their ideas. But it's also important to remember that as long as they are espousing these ideas are fair game. It's not just fair game to say, I don't agree with your ideas. It's fair game to say that your ideas are in contradiction to all known scientific facts, and they are, in fact, demonstrably stupid. And if that offends you, I don't care, because if you're going to espouse ignorance, I'm not really interested in trying to save your feelings, even if you got to that point through indoctrination, because espousing ignorance is dangerous. It has real-world, long-term effects for our society, our economy, for our mental well-being. It's dangerous. And I can't give you any credit for these ridiculous, imbecilic thoughts. I do understand that you can be a very smart person. You can have great intellect and still harbor stupid ideas. So for those fundamentalists out there, I'm not telling you that you are personally a stupid human. I am telling you, though, that your ideas with regards to young Earth creationism are not just stupid, but they are demonstrably stupid. But most importantly, I think we should keep in mind that you can't have it both ways. You can have whatever articles of faith that you like, but when your claims fly directly in the face of empirical science and empirical evidence and scientifically established facts, it's beyond fair to openly call out your ideas as being what they are, which is demonstrably stupid. In fact, it would be irresponsible of me or anyone else to sit by quietly while such people with their stupid ideas are continuing to proselytize and champion ignorance. And they are trying to put their thumbs on the scale of public policy to spread their ignorance to as many other people as possible. So while I have empathy for the people that have been raised in those systems, I can't give any sympathy for the ridiculously ignorant worldviews that they are espousing. And I don't care if that pisses people off. Thank you for being here. I hope you've enjoyed my little rant. I want to give major kudos to all of the recent members who have joined the channel. I love you. You're awesome. Thank you for being here. If I have said anything that's pissed off Yahweh or anyone else, well, they can always chime in, but they never do they? So I'm going to take this as their endorsement. I hope to see you on future videos, but until I do, I will leave you with this. Lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.